Rick, VP of Trend Micro Research. Fascinating talk. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's terrific analogy you drew about the state of play where Internet of Everything is. You compared it with the music industry from the 1970s, 80s.
Yeah, I was talking at that point about how the provision of a physical good had become digitized, and how that forced the whole music industry to go through a revolution and even question its own existence. I think at one point we were talking more about music being from the people for the people, rather than being delivered through giant corporations. But of course, business will find a way, commercial concerns will find a way, and we saw music move away from being a physical good to becoming a digital good. Through the advent of things like torrenting, and Napster nearly brought about the downfall. But the industry quickly adopted MP3 and then went on to adopt streaming. People now don't really even pay to own music anymore. They only pay to access music. They don't actually own the content anymore. When the subscription ends, so their access to the good ends. As 3D printing becomes more widespread, I think we're going to see something very similar happen in the manufacturing industry, where if a physical good is not supplied with some 3D printable spare parts templates, it will be at a commercial disadvantage to its competitors. And so if the parts are creatable at home, then of course the physical good itself to a certain extent becomes creatable at home, and manufacturing will face many of those same challenges of how do they deal with something physical and tangible becoming intangible and easily distributable.
Now that's fascinating, but having seen that music industry go through that phase, is the manufacturing industry a bit slow on the uptake?
There's probably a lack of awareness, and there's probably a certain disbelief, and what I said in the presentation is a lot of people will be looking around at each other and saying, yeah, but no one's got a 3D printer. There are very few people who have 3D printers. The ones who have make really cool things, but very few of us have them. But as I said in the room, I remember when I didn't know anyone who had a mobile phone. I didn't know anyone who had a CD player. I didn't know anyone who had a VCR. All of these things do take time. There are early adopters, and they become commonplace.
And the price of 3D printers has come down phenomenally. One's actually made it to the space station.
Yep.
So this surely is a much broader...
And that's always the biggest barrier that keeps out everyone but those early adopters. That's why I remember when CDs were launched, the only kind of music you could buy, I was working in a record shop at the time, the only kind of music you could buy on CD was classical, because it was people who listened to classical music that had all the money. So you could see who the early adopters were.
One of the suggestions for how the future might change was, I think it was a Gartner paper you're referring to, saying that there's going to be about 30 billion connected devices, and some project even
vision
more.
For 2020 was, but the estimates vary from 20, 30 billion to over 200 billion, and the conclusion that I draw from that is that no one really knows how many connected devices there will be, but there will be a lot.
And the kind of the way they interact with us so far, one of the fascinating things, you did a really good parallel. Today we operate computers the way that computers operate.
Yeah.
And in the future, as artificial intelligence and other innovations take place, computers will be more human-like.
Yeah.
And the risks associated with security would be, or the impact of the losses would be that machines could change our view of the world?
There's two different points there. So one is the point about smart machines, and I said that currently people behave in the way that computers work, because that's how we get them to do the things we want them to do. We have to modify our behavior to suit the way that computers are designed. But if we start to build smart machines and learning machines, then computers will work in the way that people behave. And it's an old saw and a true one and a given that the greatest risk in an enterprise is the employees, and it's through their bad behavior or goodwill that a lot of vulnerabilities and breaches can arise and are taken advantage of. We talk about securing the human, and it's a very different discipline to securing the system. But if we're starting to build computers that work in the way that people behave, then we open them up potentially to the same kind of social engineering which is currently used against a human, because the computer is learning and making its own decisions. So you can begin to modify how a computer learns, modify, poison the pool,
Right.
for amplified consequences further down the line. What I was talking about when I was talking about changing the way that we see the world, that was more related to the furtherance of heads-up display type technology as it becomes ubiquitous and miniaturized. And we're no longer talking about Google Glass, we're talking about Google contact lens in the future, for example. Information is available and contextual and relevant all the time, and it's overlaid on your view of the world. So the internet's no longer a discrete thing that you go away and consult and then come back to the real world. The internet's between you and life all the time. So you're no longer talking then about hacking something that someone owns. You're talking about hacking their perception of the real world, which of course can have all kinds of consequences in terms of modifying people's behavior.
Yeah, and I was just wondering, for information security professionals, what kind of training changes we'll have to undergo in order to make defend against that kind of
training is certainly, when we talk about securing the human that I mentioned before, training is absolutely your best tool.
Right.
In terms of preparing people for what does an attack actually look like, what are the possible consequences of my actions, how can I do this in a secure way, and trying to keep security uppermost in people's minds so that it's not just a one-time only, hey, you join the company, here's your security training, now off you go, we'll never see you again. But something which is rolling and ongoing and keeping security uppermost in people's minds. We're already a long way behind on getting that right, and we really need everybody in every industry really needs to ramp up their efforts for security awareness and security training, because there are big changes coming down the line.
And there will have to be a greater emphasis on how human sociology and psychology even.
Yeah, we don't do, in general terms, training that I've seen anyway within the commercial world doesn't tend to focus very much on the social engineering aspect of an attack. And I think also, I don't know whether it's particularly British or if it's particularly human, I don't know. We find it very uncomfortable. I remember myself, when we had some physical security training, and one of the obvious things that you're always told is no tailgating, don't allow anyone to come through the door behind you. But that's actually an uncomfortable thing to do.
Yeah, feels very rude.
Right, someone's right behind you and you close the door in their face. It's the opposite of everything we've always been taught. So the training has a lot to combat, a lot of learned behaviour to combat, and an uphill struggle in some areas. But it is about making a permanent change to people's behaviour, and that's a challenge.
And one of the interesting statistics, many interesting statistics, was that one study considers that anything over $100.
These are the Gartner predictions again, yeah. Any device over $100 would be a smart device, so it would be connected.
So we're talking about instead of, from Internet of Things to Internet of Everything.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a very all-pervasive, in-your-face kind of world in the...
Or not. Or it'll be pervasive, but not necessarily in your face.
Right.
And I think that's probably the greatest risk, is that it becomes so incidental, so everyday, that we begin to take it for granted. And we stop thinking about the risks inherent in the adoption of a device or a service, or the use of an API. We already don't consider security when we begin to develop things, and that's the wrong way to do it. We need to make sure something is designed with security in mind at the very outset.
Yeah. And one of the things you mentioned about, and we see this even today, there's a lot of inertia in getting some organizations, some businesses, on board with security. And even today, you mentioned ransomware. Now, I remember ransomware being an issue and a concern 10, 20, 15 years ago.
Yep.
And today, I mean, recently there's been universities.
There's been a huge explosion in ransomware recently, and actually, ransomware is now deliberately targeting enterprises, where previously it was a consumer threat.
Right.
Ransomware was designed to target consumers and look for data that was of value to consumers, photos, music, documents. But now it's, the new strains of ransomware we've been seeing over the past few months are beginning to develop capabilities which are, you can state without fear of contradiction, are designed specifically for enterprise environments, like the ability to look for network shares and cloud drives, and the ability to worm through a network and self-replicate and so on.
But they are going for softer targets as well, like universities or hospitals, and their threshold, financial thresholds, a few $20,000, $30,000.
I don't think they necessarily go after softer targets. I just think that too many of the targets are soft, which is a different challenge. What they go after is data.
Right.
So of course there's data in an education establishment, of course there's data in a hospital, and that data has value. They're motivated not by how easy it is, but how monetizable it is.
Yeah. And one of the other things that you mentioned that we have issues with at the moment, the legacy equipment.
Yep.
And you mentioned the Internet of Things will retrospectively engage with technology of the 70s, 80s, 90s.
Yep.
And you gave an example of radio.
Yep.
AIS systems.
AIS, yeah, shipping protocol.
Yeah, and so really, if that level of there's just so much technology, which as Internet of Things and Internet of Everything comes into play, people aren't going to get rid of their old technology, are they?
No, and in many cases there's no valid reason to. Did you know that the American nuclear arsenal is still controlled by an IBM Series 1 computer with 8-inch floppy drives?
8-inch floppy drives?
Yeah. From 1974-5, I think. And that computer is still in use and still controlling the US's nuclear arsenal today. And the quote from the article I was reading about it recently said the reason they haven't replaced it is because they don't need to. They use it because it works. And there's an awful lot of that stuff around. Look around, well, a hotel like this one probably, any number of retail outlets, and see how much Windows 95 you still see.
Right.
And if you don't see 95, see how much XP you still see. And think how old XP is.
and it's part of the reason why there's a reluctance to change, apart from the fact that they don't need to, it works fine. The cost, as well as the vulnerabilities in the new environment, they won't be as tested as much as the legacy kit is. That's proven.
They won't be as tested as much as the legacy kit is, but very often, and this was the problem with AIS, and has been the problem with a multitude of other things, very often those legacy things, although they've been in existence for a long time and have been tested for a long time, they're being used in ways that they weren't designed to be used now. Software-defined radio opens up radio communication to a whole load of risks like replay attacks and injection, which simply didn't exist when it was just radio. So they may have been around longer and be more tested, but they're being used in completely different scenarios to those which they were designed to be used in, and that opens up new risks as well.
And you mentioned this fascinating paper, this 2020.
Project 2020, yeah.
Just remind us where we can find that online.
You can download Project 2020 white paper at 2020.trendmicro.com. Click on the link for downloads, and the white paper is at the top of the list of things there. And there's also all 9 episodes of the mini web series that we developed to illustrate that research paper and reach out to a wider audience, so you can have some fun with that too.
Rick Ferguson, Vice President of Security Research at Trend Micro. Thank you very much indeed. That's fascinating.
Thank you.